Welcome back to Honored Madman for another microdose of some lore, or in this case, more like a theory. I imagine by now we're all familiar with the wormfaces, one of the more bizarre and mysterious enemies found throughout Elden Ring. They appear to carry and spread deathblight in a manner not unlike the basilisks. Now they don't quite spew deathblight mist like, for example, the basilisks. No, instead they vomit up a bunch of what appear to be deathblight-infused worms, the same worms that appear to make up their absence of a face. So instead of being carriers for literal deathblight mist like the basilisks, they appear to be the mobile transportation for things that do carry it, which I guess would make them second-hand carriers. And take a good look at them. Look what housing a bunch of deathblight-infected worms has done to them. Who knows what they looked like originally. They're definitely larger than the average peasant, but it's unknown whether or not this is a side effect of their affliction. They also possess these elongated necks that sort of make their head and neck look like a worm. This is probably most noticeable when they do their fountain of death worm attack. Now I was thinking maybe their elongated neck could come from their affliction with worms, maybe it's slowly turning them into a giant worm. But elongated necks aren't exactly uncommon in the lands between. You could find several peasants with a similar build, both alive and dead. Some are even afflicted with frenzy, but you get my meaning. The whole elongated neck build is something that's sort of just common to the average peasant in the lands between, which maybe implies that these guys used to just be simply peasants. And perhaps some of the larger worm faces, like the boss ones or the one in farum azula that's banging his head, maybe they used to be giants at some point, but that also kind of seems unlikely. Maybe they're just really big peasants. And I guess we shouldn't ignore the possibility that they could also just be infected onyx or alabaster lords. I mean, look at the legs, specifically on the greater worm face. They sort of look rockish, but I'm not sold on that theory either. Also worth noting that the greater wormface's hood sort of looks a little bit different than the average ones. It's wider and looks more veil-esque. At first I thought, okay, they're just people who are afflicted and the sickly, like sort of like lepers or something. Then I started thinking, well, maybe they're just big pieces of deathroot that have sort of come to life and gained sentience and are just sort of running around trying to spread the blight. Sort of like corrupted versions of the tree spirits, but I guess we already see that with the ulcerated and rotten tree spirits, and then there's like the corrupted tree avatars, so there's already a lot of different versions of corrupted trees in the game. Plus, when you see a group of these worm faces gathered, like huddled together, you can like hear them like chattering with each other. Shit, I mean, to me it looks like the three of them are just going back and forth bullshitting. Like they're just straight up having a conversation. And that shows us that these things are actually a lot more sentient than we give them credit for. But perhaps like many of the things we come across in Elden Ring or any From Software game, they're really only friendly with their own. And some of them, usually when they're by themselves, you could hear them just wailing or crying or just being all around creepy. But I do think it's quite clear that these beings have retained at least some of their intelligence, from whatever their previous form was. It's also worth mentioning that the farum azula worm faces appear to be further along in terms of how infected they are, or perhaps they just happen to be holding a lot more worms than the woodfolk ruins variant. For example, when you see these ones conversating, they appear to be coughing up worms even as they talk. Like every time they make a noise to each other, worms fall from their, I don't know what else to call it other than a gaping maw of worms. So yeah, they definitely seem capable of thought and speech at the absolute bare minimum. There really isn't much text on them in the game at all, or any mention of them really, but they're predominantly found in two places. The hidden subsection of farum azula, it's not super hidden, but I believe you have to unlock a gargoyle statue to get through to it. And of course the much more easily accessible woodfolk ruins down in Landell, sort of located in this foresty valley where they just kind of patrol throughout it, with like a council of them holding some kind of a gathering inside the actual ruins of the fort. There's also a greater worm face here, and I believe it's said that the females are the larger ones and the males are the smaller ones. That might be a quote from a Zully video, it's been a while, but they're most often found wearing robes and big old hoods to hide their nasty abyss-looking faces that happen to be strewn with worms. They're just, they're horrific, so it makes sense why they wear the hoods. The hoods themselves look reminiscent of the garb worn by Erd Tree Guardians, at least a little bit. It's the same color, but a different design or pattern on it. and that itself could indicate some affiliation with the Guardians or the Erd Tree as a whole before they were cast aside, possibly due to what they became, due to the afflicted nature of their existence. They could just be what happens when an Erd Tree Guardian's branch, or the tree that grows inside them, gets infected with death root and sort of just rots them from the inside out until their face is just a mass of worms, and perhaps the cloak they once wore they just used as a hood to hide their horrific faces. It is worth noting that the hoods seem exclusive to the ones on the ground, that is, the ones located in the Altus Plateau, specifically the woodfolk ruins and the surrounding areas. I believe that's the only place they can be found, at least in the lands between proper. There's even that boss one by the minor Erd Tree. But the ones in farum azula appear to be wrapped in a similarly golden style bandage or mummy wrap, and their faces are a lot less covered to the point where you could even count the worms on some of these guys. There also happens to be one really big, possibly boss tier one, but he doesn't have a boss health bar, located in farum azula, just sort of banging his head into the ground, which I always was confused by. That seems to indicate that they're in some kind of constant state of excruciating pain. I mean, look at that. He's just slamming his head into the ground. Or I don't know, maybe he's just trying to shake the worms off, or at least get them off of his face. But for a long time I thought that they were either some kind of malformed Erd Tree Guardians or some kind of mutated beast folk because of their presence at farum azula, sort of just kept away to the side. But I started thinking the other day, and forgive me if I'm not the first to come up with this because I haven't seen it anywhere, but I'm sure someone else has come to this assumption as well. You know who else wears a hood like that? Fia. And then I started thinking, they're both really associated with death. Maybe this is what the deathbed companions ultimately became. What do the deathbed companions even do?
You bang the dead bodies.
That's right, they're supposed to be laying with the sick and dying so that they can feel reinvigorated with energy and whatnot. But I think the deathbed companions lay with somebody who's dying and they absorb the residual energy that's left behind, effectively killing the person they're laying with, but also turning them undead. Like, I imagine most regular people turn to skeletons or zombies, but tarnished seem to turn into ghosts. But yeah, I think the deathbed companions just were able to spread death blight through, well, I imagine their touch or through banging or whatever it is exactly that they do. And the whole them rejuvenating, the dying is actually them just turning the dying into undead. That's my crackpot theory for this, at least. Should I think it's at least somewhat possible that the wormfaces are the final form for the deathbed companions? Well, the non-tarnished ones, that is. That's why Fia didn't turn into one. And that's why she's taken this leadership position with her new Cult of Death, which we will be covering in another video. I mean, there's not much evidence to back it, but I like this theory a lot more than my previous working theory, which was basically that the wormfaces were some kind of afflicted beast folk, like a subspecies of beastman that lost all of their fur and most of their face and head due to exposure to death blight. But I really like the idea of them being the original deathbed companions, just kind of malformed now. Or rather mutated, I guess would be the better term. And people will say, well, why didn't it happen to Fia? And maybe that's because she was tarnished and they weren't. I also like this idea a lot because it reminds me of that Omen member of the death cult that we've seen and talked about. You know, the one hanging out with a crew of his disciples posted up in front of a minor Erd Tree in Leyndell? Well, I can't prove it directly, but I'm sure he's tied to Fia's Cult of Death, and I'm sure he even directly serves them. And you know what he's wearing? A hood just like the wormfaces. Now, I know this is all tied to characters wearing hoods. I mean, who else wore a hood? Rennala, she actually wore the biggest hood of them all. So it's obviously loosely tied together. That's why this is a microdose of lore. And not even all the wormfaces at the woodfolk ruins even wear the hoods. In fact, the hoods mostly seem to be worn by the ones that are patrolling the woods surrounding the ruins, although there is a few exceptions. Also, like I said, this theory is really just held together by people both wearing hoods and whatnot. But this video was a good excuse to finally talk about the wormfaces and their unique nature. And all it took was me having a stupid shower thought to finally get around to covering these guys. If nothing else, I'll try to expand on all of this in my Cult of Death video that I have coming up that I haven't really announced yet, so I guess I'm announcing here. That should be the next big lore video. Well, it's not going to be super long, but next dedicated lore video for Elden Ring will be that one. But let's have our outro, fuck it. So at some point soon I want to do a video on something from one of the other From Software games. There's already a handful of ideas I want to cover, like the rise of Pontiff Sullivan, the tragedy of the Hunter Gehrman, fucking Artorias and his legacy, you know, the impact, what he did or rather didn't do, and, you know, like his legacy as it lives on in things like the Farum Abyss Watchers and their followers. Lots of good stuff. I mean, I honestly don't know where to start, but I was wondering if anybody had some suggestions as to what they'd want to see me cover from a previous From Software game. I still haven't played Demon Souls, but I played all the Dark Souls games, Bloodborne and Sekiro, so I guess it'd have to be from one of those. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you next time. As always, if you guys liked the video, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me ramble on and on and on and on, please consider subscribing, because it's what I do best, is rambling. But I'll see you guys next time. Be safe.